The goal of these tutorials is to teach you how to design your own FileMaker solutions from scratch. You can easily create a solution from a template, and that will cut a lot of corners, but you won't really know all the nuts and bolts of that solution. You won't be able to easily go in and modify it to your own needs. So I always recommend designing something from scratch. It takes longer, but you know every nook and cranny. You know how to modify it, how things work, and it makes life much easier. Now, if you create your own contact manager from one of the starter solutions in FileMaker 11, and it does everything you want, and maybe you have to add a couple of fields or something, well then that's great, that works out perfectly. But I find out that each solution is very unique to each user, and everybody wants to design their own solution, and it's not simple things that really differ, it's very major features that differ between each system somebody designs, even if they're both contact managers. So I highly recommend that you learn all the nuts and bolts. You still can use a template, and then you can use that knowledge to go in there and look at that template, study it, reverse engineer it, or again, you can go ahead and build your own solution from scratch. So you need to know all these nuts and bolts. There's no fast path to doing this. You really need to learn how to use FileMaker, and it takes a little bit of time. You can create a simple database in about 5 minutes, but if you want anything more complex with multiple tables and all these scripts and calculations, it takes a little bit more time. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the contact manager. We're viewing it right now at 800 by 600 screen resolution, and you can notice that there are scroll bars here. Even with hiding the status toolbar, you still have a scroll bar a little bit down and over to the right. Now you want to definitely try to avoid this. In fact, I will never design a solution that has scroll bars except in a list view going down, never to the left or right. So you want to make sure you look at a lot of things before you ever start designing your solution. So one of them is, what's your minimum screen resolution? If you have a multi-user solution and 10 people in the office and somebody has a fairly old computer that can only do 800 by 600, you need to make sure that you design for that minimum requirement. So check that out before you go. There's a lot of other things before you start creating your file. You have to consider cross-platform. Is the file ever going to show on the Windows platform? And along with that, there's things like graphics and fonts that differ cross-platform. I mean, FileMaker does a great job. 99% of everything you do looks the same on Mac and Windows. But there's a few things you have to consider, and you can consider, what font am I going to use? How are the graphics going to look on both platforms? It might be a little bit darker on Windows, or if you're on Windows, it might be a little bit lighter on Mac. So you need to consider that. Is your solution going to be multi-user? Then you have to consider things like record locking, which we're going to cover in later tutorials here. Are you going to deploy it on the web? You have to consider all these things, and we'll go over these as we go on, but I want to make sure you know that this is where you think about them at this point. Even though we're not covering them because you don't have enough knowledge, you have to consider them here and plan your solution accordingly so that you figure those elements into the design. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the contact manager because it doesn't really work well in 800 by 600 anyhow, and we want to show you how to create a solution from scratch. So we'll close that and go to the File menu and choose New Database. We're going to go ahead and type in contacts, and even before you go ahead and save this, you need to consider naming conventions. How are you going to name that file? You want to name it and stick with the name usually, because there's a lot of considerations. What if you have a calculation in your file that refers to the file name and you need to change the file name? Well, then you have to go to each calculation that references and update it. What if you have a multi-file solution? FileMaker can have a single file with multiple tables, so you could have one file with all these facets, but a lot of times there's reasons to make multi-file solutions, and then you have to connect them through file references. So what if you change the name there? Well, then you have to go and change all the file references. You've got to consider all these things. Again, cross-platform. Maybe the name works on the Macintosh but not on Windows because there's a certain character in there. So what I would recommend is taking a look at a PDF document at the FileMaker.com website on naming conventions. It's almost 100 pages long, and it's probably more than you need to read at this point, but at some point you should take a look at it and at least glean off some important tips. What to name your fields, what to name your files, or at least what to avoid inside those names. So again, there's a PDF document you can download at the FileMaker.com website. Very insightful, very long, very thorough, but it may give you some insights and help you to figure out what you can name your files and what you shouldn't, and at least some basic rules. So we're going to click Save here. And you notice that in FileMaker 11, it doesn't come into Managed Database. If you've used any previous versions, it goes into Managed Database immediately. That's because you can do a lot of things in here, like create fields inside of this view. We're not going to do that right now. We're going to go back to the traditional point of view. We're going to go over to the File menu, Manage Database, and we're going to start from here because I still really use this most often, this area. So we're going to cover how this works, and then later on we'll cover how to create fields and reports and things from that table view that it opens up with. So what you have here is three sections: your tables, your fields, and your relationships. So this is where everything goes on. This is where the structure of your database is created. It's the foundation of your house. It's the glue between the pieces. You have to spend a lot of time here, so you need to make sure you get familiar with how to create schema. That's what FileMaker term for this is. So we're going to go over this in the following tutorials, but we're going to give you a good overview here. So in the table section, you have one table inside this right away, and it's named based on your file. So it's called contacts. You can add as many tables here as you want, and then eventually go into relationships and relate them together. Then you have your field section, and for each one of your tables you can look at those fields, because we're only going to have one table to start with when you're learning how to use FileMaker. We're not going to get into relationships and things like that. So that's why it actually opens up in the field section to start with. You want to go ahead and create fields for your contact management system, first name, last name, all that kind of good stuff. So we're going to go over how to do that, but I want to remember this is one of the most important areas in FileMaker. You need to spend a lot of time here to create your schema. If you don't get your schema right, your structure right, your foundation right, then it doesn't matter how good your solution looks from the outside. If it's got a pretty interface. If it's wrong under the hood, then you're going to have problems with it. If it crumbles, everything else crumbles along with it. So make sure you really learn how to create a proper schema and watch how we do this. Pay attention to this. Scripts are nice, calculations are great, they do all the fancy stuff that users see, but here is where the real guts of the system works.